The Familiar by J.S. Le Fanu. I was a young man at the time, and intimately acquainted with some of the actors in this strange tale. The impression which its incidents made on me, therefore, were deep and lasting. I shall now endeavour with precision to relate them all, combining, of course, in the narrative, whatever I have learned from various sources, tending, however imperfectly, to illuminate the darkness which involves its progression and termination. Somewhere about the year 1794, the younger brother of a certain baronet, whom I shall call Sir James Barton, returned to Dublin. He had served in the navy with some distinction, having commanded one of His Majesty's frigates during the greater part of the American War. Captain Barton was apparently some 43 years of age. He was an intelligent and agreeable companion when he pleased it, though generally reserved, and occasionally even moody. In society, however, he deported himself as a man of the world and a gentleman. He had not contracted any of the brusqueness sometimes acquired at sea. On the contrary, his manners were remarkably easy, quiet, and even polished. He was in person about the middle size and somewhat strongly formed. His countenance was marked with the lines of thought, and on the whole wore an expression of gravity and melancholy, being, however, as I have said, a man of perfect breeding as well as of good family, and in affluent circumstances, he had, of course, ready access to the best society of Dublin, without the necessity of any other credentials. In his personal habits, Mr. Barton was unexpensive. He occupied lodgings in one of the then fashionable streets in the south side of the town, kept but one horse and one servant, and though a reputed freethinker, lived an orderly and moral life, indulging neither in gaming, drinking, nor any other vicious pursuit, living very much to himself without forming intimacies or choosing any companions, and appearing to mix in gay society rather for the sake of its bustle and distraction than for any opportunities it offered of interchanging thought or feeling with its votaries. Barton was therefore pronounced a saving, prudent, unsocial sort of fellow who bid fair to maintain his celibacy alike against stratagem and assault, and was likely to live to a good old age, die rich, and leave his money to a hospital. It was now apparent, however, that the nature of Mr. Barton's plans had been totally misconceived. A young lady, whom I shall call Miss Montague, was at this time introduced into the gay world by her aunt, the Dowager Lady Rochdale. Miss Montague was decidedly pretty and accomplished, and having some natural cleverness and a great deal of gaiety, became for a while a reigning toast. Her popularity, however, gained her for a time nothing more than that unsubstantial admiration which, however pleasant as an incense to vanity, is by no means necessarily antecedent to matrimony, for, unhappily for the young lady in question, it was an understood thing that beyond her personal attractions she had no kind of earthly provision. Such being the state of affairs, it will readily be believed that no little surprise was consequent upon the appearance of Captain Barton as the avowed lover of the penniless Miss Montague. His suit prospered, as might have been expected, and in a short time it was communicated by old Lady Rochdale to each of her 150 particular friends in succession that Captain Barton had actually tendered proposals of marriage, with her approbation to her niece, Miss Montague, who had moreover accepted the offer of his hand, conditionally upon the consent of her father, who was then upon his homeward voyage from India, and expected in 2 or 3 weeks at the furthest. About this consent there could be no doubt. The delay, therefore, was merely a form. They were looked upon as absolutely engaged, and Lady Rochdale, with a rigour of old-fashioned decorum with which her niece would, no doubt, gladly have dispensed, withdrew her thenceforward from all further participation in the gaieties of the town. Captain Barton was a constant visitor as well as a frequent guest at the house, and was permitted all the privileges of intimacy which a betrothed suitor is usually accorded. Such was the relation of parties when the mysterious circumstances which darken this narrative first begun to unfold themselves. Lady Rochdale resided in a handsome mansion at the north side of Dublin, and Captain Barton's lodgings, as we have already said, were situated at the south. The distance intervening was considerable, and it was Captain Barton's habit generally to walk home without an attendant, as often as he passed the evening with the old lady and her fair charge. His shortest way in such nocturnal walks lay for a considerable space through a line of streets which had as yet merely been laid out and little more than the foundations of the houses constructed. One night, shortly after his engagement with Miss Montague had commenced, he happened to remain unusually late, in company with her and Lady Rochdale. The conversation had turned upon the evidence of revelation which he had disputed with the callous scepticism of a confirmed infidel. What were called French principles had in those days found their way a good deal into fashionable society, especially that portion of it which professed allegiance to Whiggism, and neither the old lady nor her charge were so perfectly free from the taint as to look upon Mr. Barton's views as any serious objection to the proposed union. The discussion had degenerated into one upon the supernatural and the marvellous, in which he had pursued precisely the same line of argument and ridicule. In all of this, it is but truth to state, Captain Barton was guilty of no affection. The doctrines upon which he insisted were in reality but too truly the basis of his own fixed belief, if so it might be called, and perhaps not the least strange of the many strange circumstances connected with my narrative was the fact that the subject of the fearful influences I am about to describe was himself, from the deliberate conviction of years, an utter disbeliever in what are usually termed preternatural agencies. It was considerably past midnight when Mr. Barton took his leave and set out upon his solitary walk homeward. He had now reached the lonely road with its unfinished dwarf walls tracing the foundations of the projected row of houses on either side. The moon was shining mistily, and its imperfect light made the road he trod but additionally dreary. That utter silence, which has in it something indefinably exciting, reigned there and made the sound of his steps, which alone broke it, unnaturally loud and distinct. He had proceeded thus some way when he, on a sudden, heard other footfalls pattering at a measured pace, and, as it seemed, about 20 steps behind him. The suspicion of being dogged is at all times unpleasant. It is, however, especially so in a spot so lonely, and this suspicion became so strong in the mind of Captain Barton that he abruptly turned about to confront his pursuer. But, though there was quite sufficient moonlight to disclose any object upon the road he had traversed, no form of any kind was visible there. The steps he had heard could not have been the reverberation of his own, for he stamped his foot upon the ground and walked briskly up and down in the vain attempt to awake an echo. Though by no means a fanciful person, therefore, he was at least fain to charge the sounds upon his imagination and treat them as an illusion. Thus satisfying himself, he resumed his walk, and before he had proceeded a dozen paces, the mysterious footfall was again audible from behind, and this time as if with the special design of showing that the sounds were not the responses of an echo. The steps sometimes slackened nearly to a halt, and sometimes hurried for 6 or 8 strides to a run, and again abated to a walk. Captain Barton, as before, turned suddenly round, and with the same result. No object was visible above the deserted level of the road. He walked back over the same ground, determined that whatever might have been the cause of the sounds which had so disconcerted him, it should not escape his search. The endeavour, however, was unrewarded. In spite of his scepticism, he felt something like a superstitious fear stealing fast upon him, and with these unwanted and uncomfortable sensations, he once more turned and pursued his way. There was no repetition of these haunting sounds until he had reached the point where he had last stopped to retrace his steps. Here they resumed, and with sudden starts of running which threatened to bring the unseen pursuer up to the alarmed pedestrian. Captain Barton arrested his course as formerly. The unaccountable nature of the occurrence filled him with vague and disagreeable sensations, and yielding to the excitement that was gaining upon him, he shouted sternly, "Who goes there?" The sound of one's own voice, thus exerted in utter solitude and followed by total silence, has in it something unpleasantly dismaying, and he felt a degree of nervousness which perhaps from no cause had he ever known before. To the very end of this solitary street the steps pursued him, and it required a strong effort of stubborn pride on his part to resist the impulse that prompted him every moment to run for safety at the top of his speed. It was not until he had reached his lodgings and sat by his own fireside that he felt sufficiently reassured to rearrange and reconsider in his own mind the occurrences which had so discomposed him. So little a matter after all is sufficient to upset the pride of scepticism and vindicate the old simple laws of nature within us. Mr. Barton was next morning sitting at a late breakfast, reflecting upon the incidents of the previous night with more of inquisitiveness than awe. So speedily do gloomy impressions upon the fancy disappear under the cheerful influence of day, when a letter just delivered by the postman was placed upon the table before him. There was nothing remarkable in the address of this missive, except that it was written in a hand which he did not know. Perhaps it was disguised, for the tall narrow characters were sloped backwards and with the self-inflicted suspense which we often see practised in such cases. He puzzled over the inscription for a full minute before he broke the seal. When he did so, he read the following words written in the same hand. "Mr. Barton, late captain of the Dolphin, is warned of danger. He will do wisely to avoid." Here the locality of last night's adventure was named. "If he walks there as usual, he will meet with something unlucky. Let him take warning once for all, for he has reason to dread. The Watcher." Captain Barton read and reread this strange effusion. In every light and in every direction, he turned it over and over. He examined the paper on which it was written and scrutinised the handwriting once more. Defeated here, he turned to the seal. It was nothing but a patch of wax, upon which the accidental impression of a thumb was imperfectly visible. There was not the slightest mark or clue of any kind to lead him to even a guess as to its possible origin. The writer's object seemed a friendly one, and yet he subscribed himself as one whom he had reason to dread. Although the letter, its author and its real purpose were to him an inexplicable puzzle, and one, moreover, unpleasantly suggestive in his mind of other associations connected with his last night's adventure. In obedience to some feeling, perhaps of pride, Mr. Barton did not communicate, even to his intended bride, the occurrences which I have just detailed. Trifling as they might appear, they had in reality most disagreeably affected his imagination, and he cared not to disclose, even to the young lady in question, what she might possibly look upon as evidences of weakness. The letter might very well be a hoax, and the mysterious footfall but a delusion or a trick. But although he appeared to treat the whole affair as unworthy of a thought, it yet haunted him pertinaciously, tormenting him with perplexing doubts and depressing him with undefined apprehensions. Certain it is that for a considerable time afterwards he carefully avoided the street indicated in the letter as the scene of danger. It was not until about a week after the receipt of the letter, which I have transcribed, that anything further occurred to remind Captain Barton of its contents, or to counteract the gradual disappearance from his mind of the disagreeable impressions then received. He was returning one night after the interval I have stated, from the theatre, which was then situated in Crow Street, and having there seen Miss Montague and Lady Rochdale into their carriage, he loitered for some time with 2 or 3 acquaintances. With these, however, he parted close to the college and pursued his way alone. It was now fully 1 o'clock, and the streets were quite deserted. During the whole of his walk with the companions from whom he had just parted, he had been at times painfully aware of the sound of steps, as it seemed, dogging them on their way. Once or twice he had looked back in the uneasy anticipation that he was about to experience the same mysterious annoyances which had so disconcerted him a week before, and earnestly hoping that he might see some form to account naturally for the sounds. But the street was deserted. No one was visible. Proceeding now quite alone upon his homeward way, he grew really nervous and uncomfortable as he became sensible with increased distinctness of the well-known and now absolutely dreaded sounds. By the side of the dead wall which bounded the college park, the sounds followed, recommencing almost simultaneously with his own steps. The same unequal pace, sometimes slow, sometimes for a score of yards or so, quickened almost to a run, was audible from behind him. Again and again he turned. Quickly and stealthily he glanced over his shoulder, almost at every half-dozen steps, but no one was visible. The irritation of this intangible and unseen pursuit became gradually all but intolerable, and when at last he reached his home, his nerves were strung to such a pitch of excitement that he could not rest, and did not attempt even to lie down until after the daylight had broken. He was awakened by a knock at his chamber door, and his servant entering, handed him several letters which had just been received by the penny post. One among them instantly arrested his attention. A single glance at the direction aroused him thoroughly. He at once recognised its character and read as follows: "You may as well think, Captain Barton, to escape from your own shadow as from me. Do what you may. I will see you as often as I please, and you shall see me, for I do not want to hide myself as you fancy. Do not let it trouble your rest, Captain Barton, for with a good conscience, what need you fear from the eye of the Watcher?" It is scarcely necessary to dwell upon the feelings that accompanied a perusal of this strange communication. Captain Barton was observed to be unusually absent and out of spirits for several days afterwards, but no one divined the cause. Whatever he might think as to the phantom steps which followed him, there could be no possible illusion about the letters he had received, and, to say the least, their immediate sequence upon the mysterious sounds which had haunted him was an odd coincidence. The whole circumstance was, in his own mind, vaguely and instinctively connected with certain passages in his past life which of all the others he hated to remember. It happened, however, that in addition to his own approaching nuptials, Captain Barton had just then, fortunately perhaps for himself, some business of an engrossing kind connected with the adjustment of a large and long litigated claim upon certain properties. The hurry and excitement of business had its natural effect in gradually dispelling the gloom which had for a time occasionally oppressed him, and in a little while his spirits had entirely recovered their accustomed tone. During all this time, however, he was now and then dismayed by indistinct and half-heard repetitions of the same annoyance, and that in lonely places, in the daytime as well as after nightfall. These renewals of the strange impressions were, however, desultory and faint, insomuch that often he really could not, to his own satisfaction, distinguish between them and the mere suggestions of an excited imagination. One evening, he walked down to the House of Commons with a Mr. Norcott, a member, an acquaintance of his and mine. This was one of the few occasions upon which I had been in company with Captain Barton. As we walked down together, I observed that he became absent and silent, and to a degree that seemed to argue the pressure of some urgent and absorbing anxiety. I afterwards learned that during the whole of our walk he had heard the well-known footsteps tracking him as we proceeded. This, however, was the last time he suffered from this phase of the persecution, of which he was already the anxious victim. A new and a very different one was about to be presented. Of the new series of impressions which were afterwards gradually to work out his destiny, I that evening witnessed the first, and but for its relation to the train of events which followed, the incident would scarcely have been now remembered by me. As we were walking in at the passage from College Green, a man of whom I remember only that he was short in stature, looked like a foreigner and wore a kind of fur travelling cap, walked very rapidly and as if under fierce excitement directly towards us, muttering to himself fast and vehemently the while. This odd-looking person walked straight towards Barton, who was foremost of the three, and halted, regarding him for a moment or two with a look of maniacal menace and fury, and then, turning about as abruptly, he walked before us at the same agitated pace and disappeared at a side passage. I do distinctly remember being a good deal shocked at the countenance and bearing of this man, which indeed irresistibly impressed me with an undefined sense of danger, such as I have never felt before or since from the presence of anything human. But these sensations were, on my part, far from amounting to anything so disconcerting as to flurry or excite me. I had seen only a singularly evil countenance, agitated as it seemed with the excitement of madness. I was absolutely astonished, however, at the effect of this apparition upon Captain Barton. I knew him to be a man of proud courage and coolness in real danger, a circumstance which made his conduct upon this occasion the more conspicuously odd. He recoiled a step or two as the stranger advanced, and clutched my arm in silence, with what seemed to be a spasm of agony or terror. And then, as the figure disappeared, shoving me roughly back, he followed it for a few paces, stopped in great disorder, and sat down upon a form. I have never beheld a countenance more ghastly and haggard. "For God's sakes, Barton, what is the matter?" said Norcott, our companion, really alarmed at his appearance. "You're not hurt, are you? Or unwell? What is it?" "What did he say? I did not hear it. What was it?" asked Barton, wholly disregarding the question. "Nonsense," said Norcott, greatly surprised. "Who cares what the fellow said? You are unwell, Barton, decidedly unwell. Let me call a coach." "Unwell? No, not unwell," he said, evidently making an effort to recover his self-possession. "But to say the truth, I am fatigued, a little overworked, and perhaps over-anxious. You know I have been in Chancery, and the winding up of a suit is always a nervous affair. I have felt uncomfortable all this evening, but I am better now. Come. Shall we go on?" No. Take my advice, Barton, and go home. You really do need rest. You are looking quite ill. I really do insist on your allowing me to see you home," replied his friend. I seconded Norcott's advice, the more readily as it was obvious that Barton was not himself disinclined to be persuaded. He left us, declining our offered escort. I was not sufficiently intimate with Norcott to discuss the scene we had both just witnessed. I was, however, convinced from his manner and the few commonplace comments and regrets we exchanged, that he was just as little satisfied as I with the extemporary plea of illness with which he had accounted for the strange exhibition, and that we were both agreed in suspecting some lurking mystery in the matter. I called next day at Barton's lodgings to inquire for him, and learned from the servant that he had not left his room since his return the night before, but that he was not seriously indisposed and hoped to be out in a few days. That evening he sent for Dr. Richards, then in large and fashionable practice in Dublin, and their interview was, it is said, an odd one. He entered into a detail of his symptoms in an abstracted and desultory way, which seemed to argue a strange want of interest in his own cure, and, at all events, made it manifest that there was some topic engaging his mind of more engrossing importance than his present ailment. He complained of occasional palpitations and headache. Dr. Richards asked him, among other questions, whether there was any irritating circumstance or anxiety then occupying his thoughts. This he denied quickly and almost peevishly, and the physician thereupon declared his opinion that there was nothing amiss except some slight derangement of the digestion, for which he accordingly wrote a prescription, and was about to withdraw when Mr. Barton, with the air of a man who recollects a topic which had nearly escaped him, recalled him. "I beg your pardon, Doctor, but I really almost forgot. Will you permit me to ask you 2 or 3 medical questions? Rather odd ones, perhaps, but a wager depends upon their solution. You will, I hope, excuse my unreasonableness." The physician readily undertook to satisfy the inquirer. Barton seemed to have some difficulty about opening the proposed interrogatories, for he was silent for a minute, then walked to his bookcase and returned as he had gone. At last he sat down and said, "You'll think them very childish questions, but I can't recover my wager without a decision, so I must put them. I want to know first about lockjaw. If a man actually has had that complaint and appears to have died of it, so much so that a physician of average skill pronounces him actually dead, may he, after all, recover?" The physician smiled and shook his head. But a blunder may be made," resumed Barton. "Suppose an ignorant pretender to medical skill, may he be so deceived by any stage of the complaint as to mistake what is only a part of the progress of the disease for death itself?" "No one who has ever seen death," answered he, "could mistake it in a case of lockjaw." Barton mused for a few minutes. "I'm going to ask you a question, perhaps, still more childish. But first, tell me, are the regulations of foreign hospitals, such as that of, let us say, Naples, very lax and bungling? May not all kinds of blunders and slips occur in their entries of names and so forth?" Dr. Richards professed his incompetence to answer that query. "Well then, Doctor, here is the last of my questions. You will probably laugh at it, but it must out nevertheless. Is there any disease in all the range of human maladies which would have the effect of perceptibly contracting the stature and the whole frame, causing the man to shrink in all his proportions, and yet to preserve his exact resemblance to himself in every particular, with the one exception, his height and bulk? Any disease, Mark, no matter how rare, how little believed in generally, which could possibly result in producing such an effect?" The physician replied with a smile and a very decided negative. "Tell me then," said Barton abruptly, "if a man be in reasonable fear of assault from a lunatic who is at large, can he not procure a warrant for his arrest and detention?" "Really, that is more a lawyer's question than one in my way," replied Dr. Richards. "But I believe on applying to a magistrate, such a course would be directed." The physician then took his leave, but just as he reached the hall door, remembered that he had left his cane upstairs and returned. His appearance was awkward, for a piece of paper, which he recognised as his own prescription, was slowly burning upon the fire, and Barton sitting close by with an expression of settled gloom and dismay. Dr. Richards had too much tact to observe what presented itself, but he had seen quite enough to assure him that the mind and not the body of Captain Barton was in reality the seat of suffering. A few days afterwards, the following advertisement appeared in the Dublin newspapers. "If Sylvester Yelland, formerly a foremast man on board His Majesty's frigate Dolphin, or his nearest of kin, will apply to Mr. Hubert Smith, attorney, at his office, Dame Street, he or they may hear something greatly to his or their advantage. Admission may be had at any hour up to 12 o'clock at night, should parties desire to avoid observation, and the strictest secrecy as to all communications intended to be confidential shall be honourably observed." The Dolphin, as I have mentioned, was the vessel which Captain Barton had commanded, and this circumstance, connected with the extraordinary exertions made by the circulation of handbills, etc., as well as by repeated advertisements to secure for this strange notice the utmost possible publicity, suggested to Dr. Richards the idea that Captain Barton's extreme uneasiness was somehow connected with the individual to whom the advertisement was addressed, and he himself the author of it. This, however, it is needless to add, was no more than a conjecture. No information whatsoever as to the real purpose of the advertisement was divulged by the agent, nor yet any hint as to who his employer might be.